Welcome to the Farmhouse Museum that's located at the Iowa State University campus. My name is Madisyn Rostro, and I am a history and anthropology major, and this is my third year being an intern with the Farmhouse Museum. The Farmhouse Museum has had a lot of residents, including students, staff, and the first university presidents. Charles Curtis was the longest resident of the farmhouse, and he lived here for 50 years. And now we'll go on into the house and give a little tour about every object, or almost every object, and some exhibitions that we have going on right now. Welcome to the inside of the Farmhouse Museum. Currently we are in the parlor. And while I'm in the parlor, I like to show Charles Curtis, his portrait here. As I mentioned earlier, he was the longest living resident of the farmhouse. He lived here for 50 years. He had his last daughter was born in the home, and then one of his daughters were also married in the home right here at the Fireplace. So that's a really cool information to know, as he was also the second Dean of Agriculture of Iowa State University. As I mentioned earlier, the parlor was a space of entertaining, and it was a very formal space, not like your typical living room that we have today that's very informal. So within the parlor, we have several objects that I always like to talk about. The first one is the rug that I'm currently standing on. It is original to when Charles Curtis lived here in the 1900s, and then we have a lot of other pieces that are not original, but they relate to the time period, the Victorian age, that we like to purvey in the farmhouse. So some objects that we have here, for example, would be this set of pink chairs here. It's actually a courting chair, and so it was very popular during the Victorian era to court one another. And courting is basically like you're just dating another person. So you would have a chaperone that would typically sit with you guys and just make sure that you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing. And so I like to talk about this piece a lot because it's conjoined. So you have, two different chairs that are combined together, which is really unique and different from today's chairs, which are normally two separate chairs, or you have like a couch. And then the furniture set behind it is a fainting couch. So fainting couches were actually more common to be put upstairs and not typically downstairs, because during the time period in the Victorian era, women would wear corsets, and when they would go upstairs, they'd become out of breath and they would typically faint. So the fainting couches were more upstairs than they were downstairs. And we actually have two fainting couches in the farmhouse right now. We have this green one here, and then we have one in the library that you will see later on. Also in the Farmhouse Museum, we have this furniture set that was also very common in the Victorian era, which would be about the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Now with this furniture set, they're all different from one another. These two chairs are completely different from each other. Now with this one in particular, this one's got nice armrests on it, and then this one's got more of a sloped armrest. So typically in the home, this one would have been for the man of the household because of the armrest, and also because it's higher up from the ground. And then this one would have been for the woman of the household because it is lower to the ground, so her dress wouldn't get caught and maybe flash an ankle or so and become a scandalous matter of the time. And then this couch here would have been for the visitors that would have came to the farmhouse and just casual talking with the owners of the farmhouse. Something also interesting about this furniture set is that they're actually upholstered from horsehair. It was actually really common during that time to have your furniture sets made out of typical animal hair like horsehair, because they were always on the farm during that time. The parlor was also a very entertaining space, and so we have several musical instruments in the farmhouse that kind of actually purvey that. One of them being the melodeon that I have here to my right. This was actually very common during the time period in the Victorian era because it was very easy to tune compared to a piano, and it's actually a lot smaller than a piano, so it's easier to fit in the space. And then over here to my left, we have the piano, and then we also have this music box right over here. These were, again, very common pieces to have in your parlor, as they were a very entertaining space. One of the residents actually turned the parlor into an opera stage, and so she would perform her songs here in the farmhouse. That was actually very common during the time period. Women would typically sing and play the piano as a form of entertainment. Now we are in the oldest part of the farmhouse that was built in 1860. So right now we're in what we call the old kitchen, but technically this was actually the entrance into the farmhouse. So this was the kitchen and also like a living space, and then there's two small rooms right above us that were also the original part of the farmhouse. The Fitzpatricks were the first residents of the farmhouse, and they lived here with their children and then also their children's school teacher. That was actually very common during that time period, as it was a way to have a babysitter and then also a way to have an extra help of hands on the farm and in the home. Some objects that I do like to talk about in this kitchen would be the stove here. The stove served as multiple different purposes within the farmhouse, as it was a way to cook your food, and then it's also a way to heat up your home. Now, it would have been the best way to heat up your home, as it was actually really bad for your lungs, and also it didn't have the best ventilation out into the home. But it was a very common practice during that time. And then I also like to talk about this brick wall here. A lot of people are very curious about it and of why we have a bricked up doorway. So we're not exactly sure on what it led to, but it could have led to a garage or a back entryway into the farmhouse. Something unique about the bricks, actually, is that they were made in Story County, which is the county that Ames is in. Another thing that's interesting is the rug that I am standing on. This is actually called a rag rug, and it was very common during the time period in the 1860s to have a rag rug, or to use the same material that, let's say if your shirt got ripped or something like that, you would make it into a rug. You would always reuse everything. You would never waste anything because you didn't really have the resources to waste anything. Another thing in this kitchen that's unique would be the dry sink that we have here. So excuse me, in the early parts of the farmhouse, they didn't have running water, and so they would bring in water in the pitcher from the well outside and then just fill in the basin. And then they also have, right here, we have some lye soap, and this was actually very common to use during that time period as well. It was a good way to clean your hands. It was very harsh, and we actually don't use it today because of how harsh it is on your hands. One thing that we can tell that this is the later part of the home compared to the earlier part of the home is by the floor here. So you have two completely different flooring. The colors are different and the way that they're laid out is different. So the one I'm standing on is actually the original flooring of the farmhouse. And then we have the later on version that was installed by Charles Curtis that is in the parlor and kind of shows the later part of the home compared to the earlier part of the home. Right now we are in the education room, and I like to talk about this as it's a form of seeing that the farmhouse was added on. And we know that because right where I walked in right here, the floor is completely tilted, so you kind of go down slope. And then also we have a door right here that shows the slanting of the door. And it's actually kind of funny to see that the top of the door is actually cut off from the bottom of the door. So they just kind of glued it on top. But this shows the settling of the home, and that it's actually not stable at all, you know. Especially when you go upstairs, it slopes down. So that's something I like to mention about the education room. Another thing that I also like to mention is the timeline that we have here. So the timeline goes throughout Iowa State history and the farmhouse history. And it talks about how the farmhouse started off as a model farm. So students would actually come here and they would work on the farm, and that was a form of their tuition. So it was actually free to come to Iowa State University during that time. But again, you had to work on the farm. And then later on, it talks about the first graduating class and how they came here in the year 1869. And even though Iowa State was founded in 1858, the class did not come here till 1869 because of the Civil War during that time period. We had a lot of men going off to fight, and so that kind of affected classes and students that would attend here. And then it goes all the way throughout Charles Curtis's time that he lived in the farmhouse, and then talks about how the farmhouse was turned into a home economics department, and women would come here to learn how to cook, clean, and even take care of a baby. So that's something interesting that people don't know about the farmhouse, but it's also really cool to talk about. Then towards the end of the timeline, it talks more about the Farmhouse Museum becoming a historical landmark and a museum that it is today, that we can educate others about Iowa State history and also Iowa history as well. So right now we're in the dining room of the Farmhouse Museum. And we have it as a dining room right now, but it hasn't always been a dining room. Before, it's been a library, it's been a bedroom, so several other different things. Some objects I like to point out in here would be the lace curtains over here. So lace curtains were actually very common during the Victorian era to have in your home. And they're kind of unique because they have this unique pattern to them, which is also not like your typical curtains at home as today. They're more delicate and you have to be careful with them because they could tear easily because they are lace. Another thing I like to mention in here is the wallpaper in the dining room. It's actually really cool to know that Queen Victoria had the same wallpaper in her palace, and it's also the Henry Moore style, that's the name of it. But before we had these really ugly fruit basket wallpaper, and during the restoration they changed it to make it look more, it just fit the time period better. So right now we have it as a Henry Moore style that fits the Victorian age way better than the old wallpaper. So right now we're in the library of the farmhouse. And I like to talk about several different objects in this room as well, and one of them being this picture right here. So this picture was taken in 1907 or 1908, and it actually shows the inside of the farmhouse. It's the earliest picture we have of the farmhouse, and it actually shows what it looked like when Charles Curtis lived here. And it's actually unique because it actually shows a typical Halloween, what your library should look like during Halloween. And a few things that they have in here that makes it look Halloween would be a pumpkin here, and then they have corn stalks, and they have even a picture over here in the top right, a picture of corn. So it's kind of funny to know. There is one, in particular, one object that is original that we see in this picture, and that would be the North Wind chair. So this is actually the original chair that we see in this picture. That is also really cool to know because of how old it is. As I mentioned earlier, it's taken in 1907 or 1908. And Charles Curtis actually used this chair, and you can kind of tell because you have the wear and tear on the chair here. You can see where someone would have like laid their arms, and then you have some wear on the North Wind man as well. Another thing I like to talk about is this hair wreath here that I'm holding. So hair wreaths are actually made out of human hair, and they were a way to kind of remember your loved ones in case if someone did die or if someone went away, you would make art with their hair as a way to remember them. I know I've been to a different museum and I saw a huge bouquet of human hair, and as some people think it's disgusting, it's also kind of interesting, an interesting way to see of how they remember their loved ones. It's completely different than a picture that we would take today, as you would get to see their face, but it's also the same way of remembering somebody. Over here we have a fireplace, and it was actually restored in the early 2000s to show what it looked like during when Charles Curtis lived here. Before, it was actually bricked over, and then in 2006 they decided to restore it back to what it originally looks like. And then over here, I like to talk about this magazine/bookshelf case. It has Charles Curtis initials carved into it, CFC, and then also 1901. And 1901 because it was gifted to him from the class of 1901. So this piece is actually really cool to talk about because it is original to the farmhouse, it's original to Charles Curtis, and it's also really nice to paint some objects on as well. Over here we have some other objects I'd like to talk about. The first one is over here, the taxidermy case. This was actually a very common tool in the Victorian era. The mothers of the household would go out, find animals, and stuff them, and they would actually use arsenic to clean out the animals. So as we know today, it's a very toxic chemical. We would not use that today for taxidermy. But some animals in here I like to point out, we have a squirrel, dove, there's even fish all the way down here. So they were very detailed in the number of animals they put into the taxidermy case. And then we also have another one upstairs, a very smaller one. That has a few smaller animals, mainly just birds. But this one shows, the numerous different animals that they would have talked about during that time period. Something else I also like to talk about are the Native American baskets. So we have one right here that you would see as maybe has a swastika symbol. It's actually a whirling log symbol, and Native Americans used it long before Hitler did, and it has completely different meaning than what Hitler took it and interpreted it as. So the whirling log symbol actually meant peace. And so I think the Native American baskets are really good to have in the farmhouse because, first of all, it talks about that the land that we are on is Native American land, so we like to be aware of that and aware of the culture that that is relevant today. And then also because Charles Curtis did have some Native American baskets in his library as well during that time period. So right now we're in the children's room of the farmhouse on the second floor. And some things I like to talk about in this room is the numerous different dolls in here. That was very common during the time periods for children to have dolls, checkered sets to play with, a baby carriage to also take your doll for a stroll. Another little object I like to talk about is this teddy bear right here. So the teddy bear actually got its name from Teddy Roosevelt, and the story I like to tell with that is that one day Teddy Roosevelt was actually going on a hunt with his friends, and he was looking for a bear to kill. And he couldn't find one, but his friend did, and he tied the bear up to a tree and told Teddy to kill it. Well, Teddy thought that was really inhumane, and so he decided not to kill it and let the bear go. And that story actually got all the way back to Washington, D.C., and a candy maker actually heard the story and thought it was a very funny story, and so he decided to start making teddy bears because he thought the kind gesture of the president was a very, very uplifting and kind of funny story of the typical Teddy Roosevelt you would think of. That was a very he loved to go out and hunt. And so that's why today we have the teddy bear here. A little different than your typical teddy bear today, but still the same concept of why we have teddy bears and their name and how, what the story came from. So right now we're in the strawberry bedroom, and we call it the strawberry bedroom because of the wallpaper around here. It's little strawberries all over the room, which is kind of cool to know. But back to the objects. So we have an object over here. It's actually this dress, and this was actually very common for women to wear in the Victorian era. And it was actually replicated after what Carrie Chapman Catt wore during one of her speeches that she gave. So again, very common to wear. And it's blue, delicate. It's got nice little lace detailing up here and down here, and a nice little shawl covering. Another thing I like to talk about is this crazy quilt here. Now this crazy quilt is actually in my Farmhouse 160 exhibition. There's numerous different little papers throughout the farmhouse that talk about the exhibition and the different objects and also events that happen throughout the farmhouse in the 160th time period. But back to this crazy quilt. So this crazy quilt is actually kind of cool to look at in person and also over camera because it has numerous pieces of embroidery and hand painted pieces like flowers and stuff like that. It's really unique and different from that time period, and it also has some lace detailing down here as well. So these were actually really common in the late 1800s, and they took a lot of influence from English embroidery and also Japanese art as well. And then over here we have this lamp set. So this is actually called a marriage lamp, and I like it a lot because of how blue it is. It's very vibrant and different compared to different lamps or lamps that you would have seen during that time period. And it's called a marriage lamp just because it has two light bulb areas that kind of come together down the bottom, and so that's why they call it the marriage lamp. But lamps were actually very common during the Victorian era, as they used whale lamps, whale oil lamps, and kerosene lamps and oil lamps. Soon we'll have an exhibition out called Flicker and Flame that talks about those different lamps and also electrified lamps as well. So this concludes our virtual tour today. There are still 6 bedrooms in this home that we did not get the chance to see, but that just goes to show that this farmhouse is a lot bigger than it looks, and that there's several different rooms that if you have time, you can come to the Iowa State University campus, come into the farmhouse. It's always free to come in, and you can look at all these different rooms. Or if there's objects that you saw during the tour that you wanted to take a more closer look at, you're more than welcome to. And then also you can look at the numerous different exhibitions we have out. You can look at Farmhouse 160, you can look at the Victorian book illustrations, done by women during the Victorian era. Or if you come later on in next semester, you can look at Flicker and Flame. That will be out. And if you are curious more about Farmhouse, you can go to the University Museum's webpage and look at the hours and different events that we will be hosting. But again, thank you so much for coming, and see you next time.